This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. What does a poem look like? Visual poet Monica Ong grew up as an art school kid. She had deep interests in photography and print artistry, but also a love for language. Merging the worlds of fine art and poetry, Monica has created both stunning works of art and poetry, inviting the reader to experiment. Today, she joins us for the hour to talk about her work and her new book, Planetaria. I started by asking her to define what it means to be a visual poet.
So in my creative practice, visual poetry is a kind of alchemy of text and image, whereby each of the elements participate in a poem's context, structure, and its meaning. And for a visual poet, authorship originates in both the composition of the writing and the design decisions you're making about a poem's medium, its context, the typography, the graphic expression, and even how users might interact with it. And for me, text and images don't echo one another like a caption or decorative illustration, but instead they mutually enhance one another's syntactical power to achieve a poetic experience of feeling that each element couldn't otherwise achieve on their own.
Well, and then visual poetry is one of those things I feel like a lot of people are not super familiar with yet, as we're having this conversation. How did you first get interested in poetry that led you to this moment?
Well, I was definitely an art school kid. I was always thinking very, very visually, and I was working on a very early project with family histories and photographs and archives, and I kept noticing that there were so many family secrets that the images by themselves could not convey. And so writing became a really important element to allow a much more intimate experience for my audiences and to kind of unpack not only the things that we learn, but the things that are also unsaid. And I find that visual poetry is able to open a space where we can explore hidden histories in a much more nuanced way.
So would you say you were inspired by photographs and visual images that you found that led you to ask those questions versus were there writers or poets who inspired you, or is it a mix of the two?
I would say it's definitely a mix of the two. I think, being someone who has been in the design profession, I will certainly be someone that's always like walking around the world looking at things, looking for visually interesting things. And I'll often find materials or objects that I'll sometimes say, that would be so cool as if that was the form of a poem, right? But at the same time, I've always been interested in experimental poets who have had some kind of visual practice, in their writing, as much as I've always loved visual artists who use text as a medium for their work. So I think a lot about, the avant-gardes like Teresa Hakyang Cha, the artists of the Fluxus movement, from like Dick Higgins to like typographer poets like Phil Gallo, for example. But again, visual artists like Zhu Bing or Laurie Anderson or Jenny Holzer are just as interesting to me in the way that they make these really immersive experiences of art that bring, that have really strong textual elements in them.
And can you talk about your sort of process getting to your visual poetry today? What are some earlier versions of that? Like, what did that look like for you and the evolution of that mashup?
Well, in a lot of my earlier work, which was, part of my first book, Silent Anatomies, I was really interested in the cultural silences of the body and using a lot of medical ephemera as a site for, personal and family histories, and kind of these medical, emotional narratives, in the family. And so I was making poems on medicine bottles, X-ray scans of the brain, or diagrams of the lungs, and in a sense, taking these medical or anatomical diagrams, removing the original clinical text and then bringing my own lyrical explorations into these spaces to invite a very different kind of reading, if you will. And as I, worked on these, I kind of created almost like experiments, with these, one project at a time. And I typically worked on a lot of projects in series towards, little exhibitions early on. And in this process, I started going to poetry retreats, and I would meet poets who would say, you really should take all this work you're doing in these galleries and turn them into a book, And so that was a really interesting and exciting experience to kind of, again, put my designer's hat on and think about how do you design these things into these different kinds of reading, right? And I would say the first book was very much, kind of looking into history, looking very inward. And as I moved into this newer series, which uses the sort of visual language of astronomy, I started turning my gaze kind of outward, into space, into possible futures. And so, and again, this invited a lot of really interesting experiments, like how do you create a poem using star charts and constellation maps? And how might these be interesting to interact with, whether it's as a planisphere or in a planetarium, for example. So, what I really love about visual poetry is that it opens up a space for me to imagine what a poem could be.
Well, I'm still kind of stuck on the idea that you are so inspired by objects. And I think that's a very human thing, because I wonder how many of us love sort of scavenging in an antique shop and finding that perfect thing that you didn't realize you were looking for. Or even you describing like star charts and whatnot. So I feel like those are also ephemera that people love, like an antique compass, an antique telescope. And I want to dig in a little bit more about how you sort of extract stories from the objects versus I'm actually a person that likes to give the object a story. So I have sort of my story within the object. So most of my tchotchkes that you see around my house or my office desk, there's typically a story behind it because I gave it a story. But you're doing the other way around. So how does that work? Give us an idea of what that looks like. So you're walking around somewhere, you find this thing. What happens after you get inspired?
I love this question because when I think about the kinds of objects that I encounter, for example, like a planisphere, let's say, I think of it as kind of like a door opening to histories, that maybe I don't know that much about, but that I can come into conversation with. Mm-hmm. And what I was noticing when I was looking at these vintage, ephemera, whether it was old astronomy textbooks or, histories of science, was that these were very, very male spaces, right? And when you look at figures and mythologies enshrined in the stars, they kind of speak of, male hero journey, conqueror, like these stories of conquest. And it starts opening up interesting questions in my mind, like what would it mean to, reimagine this from a female perspective, perhaps, or what are some missing constellations that, I might imagine, and so as this door starts opening and these questions linger in my mind, it becomes a kind of prompt that I start writing towards and designing towards, and I think. Particularly for those who come out of like a design school, tradition, that's part of design thinking is that you're working with or towards some kind of question. And I think throughout this collection, it's kind of interrogating, like, what would it mean to expand our gaze, And I think there are aspects of, the objects that also make me think about, how do we read it? How do we interact with it? And how might I leverage that to invite a closer reading of a poem, to slow people down? Because, we're in a very busy attention economy,
A
right?
lot of distractions.
A lot of distractions, and it's sometimes very difficult to hold the gaze anymore, right? To really spend some time with a poem or somebody's story. And so I think that what's nice about these kind of like analog objects is that they create this really, intimate space where we can kind of go deep and where you can, read and rediscover a poem in many different ways as well.
Right. I mean, I'm a fan of rereading and rewatching things, and I always find like I every experience is almost a completely different experience from the previous. And I love this idea that you were talking about, sort of expanding our poetry horizons as the universe is expanding. Like that's going real deep here, and I think there's a sense of play that you're giving me when you're seeing these objects, when you're exploring what stories are within these. Is that an experience that you're hoping your readers to have, even though there is sort of like a final product before them, which is the poem or the collection of poetry? Do you still feel like there is an interactiveness there that readers can engage in? Speaking of the slowing down or really focusing on the poetry, because unless you're doing that, you're not really getting anything out of it.
Definitely. I think the author-reader relationship here is definitely more collaborative. So, for example, there's a few poems in the collection that are framed as these kind of constellation maps. And as such, there is no fixed linear order of reading, right? And what I really enjoy is when I visit, classrooms or readers who read the poems to me in a completely different way than perhaps I would, because star charts are very exploratory, right. And I wanted to invite reading that was akin to stargazing, right, where your eyes kind of naturally wander and make connections among different stars and constellations. And so the verses likewise are scattered on the page in that kind of way. And it's just lovely when I hear someone read a poem back and it just comes to me in a completely new way. So there's a lot of possibilities for each reader to have their own unique reading of each poem.
Right, and it's not just reading a poem differently, it's also having different words, right? Constructing a poem for themselves. And because the way you do visual poetry, it does require the reader to be a bit more interactive with your work and be engaged. So you're inviting them to be a part of the creation. So I guess in some ways, does it feel like you have hundreds or thousands of co-authors?
Yeah, and what I love too is when I think about other pieces I've made, like the Stargazer, where the reader, it's basically a planisphere poem where you can align the date to a specific time of day, and the planisphere will not only show you the stars in the sky at that moment, but also reveal the poem at that moment in time. And what's interesting is that the poem that you might read in the spring to a friend might be really different than the poem you would read in the autumn during a reflective night by yourself, right? That even your time, space context will shift, the color and the tone and the texture of the poem. And I think, to me, underlying all of that is this like hope to create like this broader sense of connection, right? Whether it's our connection with each other or to the broader world around us.
Well, and then with that connection too, I think just sort of continuing on this idea that the visual poetry does allow people to interact and engage more than I think compared to sort of your regular poetry, if you will. Do you think that this helps us sort of think beyond the linear and expand our thought processes? Like the idea that there is something else beyond this specific line of poetry that I can explore because the world is complex and being a human being is complex.
Yeah, definitely. I think my hope is also to kind of expand, traditional ideas of, for example, literature or this other category we call art, right? That there's almost like a third space, right? And a lot of times when I think about what they call like hybrid poetry is kind of existing in that kind of overlap, I love that idea because it allows more space for us to explore, like what these kinds of creative experiences can be.
Well, and then you mentioned earlier too that you have explored anatomy and poetry, which are two things that I don't think people usually put them together, right? Which is kind of the point here. And you also include an artist book displayed on a print of the lungs and a poem that's printed on a CT scan, which is really cool. Really cool imagery anyway. But so I think we tend to think art and sciences as separate categories. I think we're getting better at recognizing that that's very much connected. And I think we are connecting the two spaces more now. So can you tell us about what inspired you to connect poetry and anatomy and what that looks like for you?
I guess the way I would think of it is poetry allows me to explore the things that I either don't know very much about or am even kind of a little bit intimidated by, I think, I grew up as a daughter of a physician, and also someone who was aware that I, felt very nervous in kind of like math and science spaces, but was always very intrigued by them.
I'm actually very similar. I mean, I didn't grow up with people. I didn't grow up with people around me who are in the STEM field, I guess. But it was something that's very much present, and I never felt like I really had the language to understand it. But I'm very curious about it as an adult.
No, absolutely. And I think the poet Tracy K. Smith, she kind of coined this phrase called science envy, which is kind of what I had, is that I always kind of looked from afar with a lot of admiration and kind of awe and wonder. And when I found myself making work using, these sort of like scientific ephemera, there was something, familiar about it, but also in a way became a kind of canvas, to delve into like these things I wanted to explore, the questions that I had. And because I was a daughter of a physician, I grew up around tons and tons of medical journals, like diagrams, just all kinds of knickknacks from the hospital, like around the house. So their materiality and also the way they kind of bewildered me, I found really interesting. And I think that every time I looked at a diagram, I've always felt like there was something about the language that was really interesting to me, but also a need for translation. And it felt very like personal to me because it was kind of the same way in which I was always trying to translate my understanding of my parents' experience as immigrants. There's also like a level of translation and me really trying to almost kind of decipher and understand these histories that I would get little clues about from my parents, but that are largely, that a lot of that, the material history was left, in their homelands. So I found that in the process of learning about their histories, these like medical ephemera spaces kind of allowed me to explore, these sort of processes of translation simultaneously.
Well, and I don't know if it's because we're having this conversation that I feel like my visualization is so heightened right now because as you're describing those objects, I can see it as if it's in my own house. And I think it is so fascinating that I think like many aspects of art, it's never just one kind of art. It's all so connected because you're talking about translations, you're talking about poetry, but in some ways you're also doing a lot of detective work. You're doing a lot of research. You're doing a lot of reading to sort of decipher or dissect, if you will, what your parents' experiences was like. Was there anything from that process that surprised you at all? Or I imagine probably many moments.
Yeah, I think, when I was working on, a lot of the works in silent anatomies, I actually saw a shift in my relationship with my parents, which, growing up, my role was always like the dutiful daughter, and it was a very one-way kind of communication. And I remember traveling, to the Philippines, which is where my parents were born and raised, and also to southern China, which is where their families had migrated from. And I found that in that process of them working with me on translating, stories from relatives. Suddenly, we were becoming collaborators, and I was hearing a lot of things about them that I never knew. Because again, when you kind of grow up in the Midwest, and you kind of take for granted, right? Like kind of what you think you know about them,
Sure.
and then you get invited into these really intimate histories, and then suddenly you're kind of getting to know your parents in a completely different way, and I think also seeing these family archives and photographs and the spaces that the familiar places that they gave up in order to kind of come into this really unknown place, right, for the sake of a better future. I think it really deepened my appreciation, for them as well, and I think those are all things that I carry with me into my work, because I think there's always more we can discover. That what we think we know about something, whether it's a person, a place, a process, or a medium, there's always so much more around the corner that we don't realize we can discover, but we have to be willing to stay with it long enough, to be surprised.
Well, and amazing that your parents and your family were willing to share those stories, because I know a lot of families maybe feel intimidated, or there's a timidity to it that they don't want to explore. So I think it's cool that I see where the curiosity comes from.
Yeah, and I agree that the silences, are very real, right? There's a lot of cultural stigma. There are things that feel very taboo. And what I appreciate about art, and particularly visual poetry, was that it suddenly offers this impartial reference point that people can talk about these stories with, right? Where the attention isn't fully on, you or me, but that art can provide this other space where we can talk about these deep or perhaps taboo things in a way that still feels safe for people. And I found that what was interesting when I was visiting different communities with that book was that people were willing to open up about stories about these sort of health narratives or stories about the body in a way that I don't think would just naturally occur otherwise.
Well, I think it's those magical moments, right, where this is your experience, this is your family's experience, but then realizing that this is actually an experience for a lot of people. And oftentimes readers, let's say, they'll see something and like, oh my God, like that's my experience too. Like there's something really magical about that connection. And so when you discovered that this is sort of what was happening, what are some of the things that you heard from readers or people who are experiencing your poetry and making those connections?
So I think one moment that I really cherish was at one point I was doing an exhibition at the Poetry Foundation, and we were having a gallery event. And I recall, a woman who came into the gallery, and she was so excited to speak with me. And she told me that she was a nurse who had literally run from her shift to catch me at the gallery, because she was sharing with me how much the Silent Anatomies as book really meant to her, and the way that it changed how she and her family talked about, some of these, stories and these silences, like in her family. And I remember we were both like kind of almost moved to tears, like in the gallery. But I think, when you have moments like that, it makes you realize, like, this is so worth it, right? Like all of the kinds of questions that I muddle through, and the struggles I have in the studio are really so that I can open up, some kind of shared understanding with the reader, and really like to make them feel seen,
So I think it's amazing that a nurse came to you to make this connection. I think that's really wonderful, and the connection happened because of your own curiosity, and I think you've taken this even further to explore the stories of marginalized communities and historical erasure. And you mentioned earlier hidden histories and also many underrepresented experiences, and how all of this really connects back to the body. Can you describe how you were able to make those connections in your work?
So I think one way I might describe that would be maybe with a specific work. One of the poems in this collection is called Her Gaze, and it's a poem that tries to shed light on the story of Caroline Herschel. You know, she was the younger sister of the more famous William Herschel, but is someone that's only beginning to kind of get her due these days. And I was thinking a lot about what would happen to a poem if I created it as an experience with the Viewmaster reel. Because what I liked about the Viewmaster reel is that when you use it, the body is actually gazing up, towards the sky, right? You're looking skyward. And the poem is framed by sketches she made while observing a comet, around like 1786. And I loved this idea of the viewer gazing up at evidence of women's labor, right? Which is so often invisible, right? And so what happens is that the process of reading the poem also positions the reader to look up with reverence, if you will, towards women's labor. And what it does is that it kind of sets up, it primes the space for the reader to then interact with, a lyrical experience that tries to pay tribute to the many facets of Caroline Herschel's life. She was one of the first women to receive a salary as a scientist. She was also an accomplished musician who sang soprano, but she was also incredibly, astute, in her dedication to astronomy as someone whose labor made possible the incredible discoveries of her brother as well. So that's like one way I think about it, is that how do you create a way for readers to really kind of like embody, have an embodied experience, and how do you design a context of reading that really heighten what that experience of poetry can be.
More with Connecticut artist and visual poet Monica Ong after a short break. You can join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, Connecticut artist and visual poet Monica Ong joins us. When she started writing her new book, Planetaria, she was navigating motherhood and exploring a new interest in astronomy. I asked her about this and how she merged these two worlds.
So when I started writing a lot of the work for Planetaria, I was definitely in a place of young motherhood, trying to balance so many things, from full-time work to running, this experimental poetry studio, trying to do all the things, but feeling like I was failing constantly. And at that time, I started watching a lot of science programs, and there was something really refreshing about learning how to kind of zoom back on things, and, to kind of expand ourselves a little bit, make a little bit more room for possibility. And I think too, when I started looking at these, early vintage textbooks too, I kept asking myself, like, what would it mean to, turn these into poems that could help me develop my own, in a way, textbook, if you will, for navigating motherhood on my own terms, right? Because I think I was feeling rather restricted by a lot of societal expectations on, what it should look like. And I think the ways in which scientific discovery is always expanding our ideas about things, I wanted to kind of expand my own ideas about what motherhood could be.
Well, I definitely want to get back to the role of science that plays in your art. But do you think, Or how do you think your poetry has changed since you became a mother? Did it change at all?
Definitely. I think a lot of my earlier poetry was often in conversation with history. So, like a looking back, really almost writing towards my ancestors, asking questions, interrogating my relationship with all these varied histories and different places. And I think when I became a mother, I found myself looking more future forward, right? And kind of trying to imagine what these possible futures could look like. And I think in a way it pushed me to like newer territory, to get a little bit more daring in my experiments. And I think because I always enjoyed watching and also fostering a sense of play, like, with my family. And I find that definitely informing the way I was playing more in the studio. And I sometimes, it's this reminder of like, yeah, you got to lighten up sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
And allow yourself, just like we tell our young people, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to try new things. And I think it came at the perfect time because I think it's so easy to start getting rigid and wanting to be like work by a formula sometimes. And I think that sometimes for me, the best surprises are the ones that you don't anticipate.
Right. Hence the surprise. And it's funny because I'm starting to see that thread of your exploration with science and poetry because they're both very much areas that have constant innovation. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they oftentimes, I think, get into a rut, but there's always innovation and the rut kind of happening at the same time, right? And I really want to know more about your philosophy behind the role science plays in your storytelling, especially when you are actively breaking sort of traditional narratives on immigration stories or historical erasures or the explorations of hidden histories and pursuing the truth. And because I'm thinking science is always changing. We're always changing as human beings. And even our own sort of history is changing in the sense of you discover new information, like you were sharing earlier, that there are things about your parents and your family that you had no idea until you started the conversation, right? So I wonder how all of this relates back to the way you think about storytelling.
So the epigraph that opens the book comes from one of my muses, who is the experimental physicist Chen Xiangbu. And she had said, the main stumbling block in the way of any progress is and always has been unimpeachable tradition. When I read that, it really stuck in my mind because I think the voice throughout this collection is that of someone wrestling, with these sort of traditional conventions, but defiantly trying to not be restricted by them, right? And I think whether it's writing in a way that is not constrained by what's already existed, to imagining ways of mothering, right? That perhaps don't fall under a known formula already. Because again, the world is so new. This generation is facing so many new challenges. It does require us to be willing and open to collaborate with them, right? And I think, again, there's always this invitation to collaboration that I think also is really central in the kinds of ways I want to be in relation with others and in community.
Right. And I think sometimes the restrictions play a role in the loss of stories because you also explore historical erasure and the loss of cultural memory together. And do you see this as connected to motherhood? And just to sort of dig into that a little bit more is, whose job is it to preserve and pass on cultural memories? Because I imagine, because we're talking about motherhood specifically now, that mothers can't do this alone. And oftentimes it is a two-way. If the mother doesn't want to share, it happens where the child wouldn't have those stories and, vice versa in some way.
So I think one of the biggest inspirations for this book was my son, who during the pandemic when he saw me poring over all kinds of star maps and constellation histories, asked me if I knew anything about the stories of the Chinese night sky, and I actually did not. Mm-hmm. And it was a really great invitation to delve deeper into these stories, to really be a student, again, of science and science histories, and then to bring my own interpretation of these stories into these poems that I feel really are in conversation with him. I think of these poems also as a kind of bridge, if you will, that opens a door between our history and our future. And I really try to create a way to not only share what I learn, but also to kind of pique people's interest to learn more.
Well, I love the intimacy that you share in terms of collaboration. What was it like being able to actually collaborate with your son in this case, having those conversations and making sort of those mythologies your own? Because I know Chinese mythology is sort of an area that is constantly going through reinvention, whether it's through novels or TV shows, but it's very much present, I think, in the culture.
I think early on when I was doing research for this book, we went to a lot of museums. Mm-hmm. We went to a lot of planetarium shows together. And I think, it made sense to me because finding time to research and make art was something I just couldn't do apart from parenting. So it's like every time we went out, it was like, how do I schedule these things together? So It was kind of partly a practical matter. But then as my research deepened, his own interest in science also really deepened as well, which was actually kind of, again, it wasn't anything planned. It just sort of naturally arose from it. And now that he is like in his teenage years, mm-hmm. he's like always correcting me all the time.
Of course.
Like he'll say factually, mm-hmm. it's actually this or this or that. Yeah. And it's really great because again, there's this kind of like mutual learning and this mutual back and forth that always really keeps me on my toes. And in a way, he helps me bring my best, to the studio so I can give my best to my readers.
Right. That's so wonderful. I love that relationship so much. It actually reminds me of my own relationship with my mom and my dad. Really, it's always factually.
Yes.
I'm going to steal that phrase from your son. Please thank him for me. And I think this is a perfect moment if you can share one of your poems from your new book, Planetaria, with us.
Absolutely. I'd love to. So as I mentioned, there are many poems in Planetaria that are inspired by the Chinese night sky. And the Chinese night sky is quite different than the Greco-Roman sky that we might be familiar with growing up, in the sense that the sky that we might already know is comprised of 88 large constellations that have these sort of mythical gods and creatures. The star chart that I was working from is known as the Suchao astronomical chart, and it dates back to around 1193 from the Song dynasty. And it's a star chart with images that tend to reflect the social, political, and geographical landscape of the emperor and his court, right? Mm-hmm. And there are many characters that you will see, from advisors to concubine's son to generals, to also farmers and markets and butchers as well as a lot of spaces typical of that time, like temples, wells, all that. And what's interesting is that the way the sky is organized is that there are, select stars along the lunar path, known as the 28 mansions, and they are guarded by 4 guardian animals, which include, the white tiger of the west, the azure dragon of the east, the phoenix of the south, and the black warrior of the north. So I did a set of poems based on these guardian animals, and the piece I'm going to read to you today is based on the azure dragon of the east. And I wanted to write a poem as kind of a coming of age poem based on this Buddhist parable of the Dragon King's daughter, who was part dragon and part human. And she confounded the contemporaries of her time, who kept asking, how could a woman of mixed identity possibly attain enlightenment, right? And so, so this is called Azure Dragon. The azure dragon of the eastern sky rules over 7 mansions: winnow basket, tail, heart, room, roots, neck, and horn. Associated with the season of spring and the element of wood, her wingspan extends 7 generations forward and 7 generations back. Wings winnow the distance from one realm to another, baskets full of falling, magnolia petals failing, memory too thin to breathe. When will we Dragon King daughters no longer walk this world hiding our tails, rummaging in the dark for a flash of glimmerglass heart? Who are you when the room empties, when doing what they don't believe you can do? Tend to these homegrown roots steeped in the mantra of long trains rumbling beneath this carbon body. Its sheen of horns break up the soily crust of your improbability. Tomorrow hangs on the neck like a soft cocoon that twists, writhes, releases you, jewel of unfettered light.
More with Connecticut artist and visual poet Monica Ong after a short break. You can join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, Connecticut author and visual poet Monica Ong is with us. We recently spoke with her about her new book of poetry, Planetaria. Monica recently held a special exhibition at the Leitner Family Observatory and Planetarium at Yale University, and she told us this was a dream come true.
It was one of the most joyful and also challenging design experiences I've ever had. It was such a fun time. I think first I have to shout out the Yale Quantum Institute for really fostering such a great collaboration with the Leitner Observatory and Planetarium. Working with scientists is such a blast because they are always game for experimentation. And when I was thinking about how to design a poetry reading in the planetarium, I loved that its dome shape kind of makes me think of like this cocoon, you know, and that it could be this cocoon of wonder and connection. And I loved being able to contextualize the visual poems within the sky of stars, the very stars that inspired these poems, as well as traveling with the audiences to various views of the universe, whether it's the Milky Way or the surface of the moon, as another way of framing these experiences of poetry. I think at the end, one viewer summed it up best. He told me this experience felt like a warm hug. And I think, you know, I just went home with the biggest smile on my face.
That's beautiful. And what a dream come true to have that experience and hear that directly from someone who was there. And I love this sort of connection of you look up at the night sky, you know, someone could be inspired to go into space and go into science. And then another person can be inspired to go into the arts. And here we are kind of speaking about that connection between the two. And you have done visual poetry, sort of blending the two together, right? And we've been talking about the connection between art and science. What's your advice to the next generation of artists and poets and creators who, I think in some ways, many of them naturally want to break barriers, want to be innovative, but it can be scary to do that. And there's also the big question of how do you innovate? What would you say to them if someone came up to you and asked you that? Another very big question for you.
No, this is such a great question. I tend to try to root my line of thinking in questions that really get me excited. And so when I'm in the studio, I always kind of go back to one question, which is, how can I encourage just one person? Because I think when I'm orienting myself in that direction, it helps me really understand what kind of connections I need to make in my creative decisions. In terms of how artists can continually innovate, I think it's also important to, be the kinds of design thinkers that don't see failure, but look at each trial as a learning opportunity, right? That there is data you can collect from, each experiment gone wrong, or,
Right.
each attempt that falls flat. Because again, for all of these works, there were probably 10, 20, 30 versions that didn't work, right? And I guess, scientists will tell you that all the time, that you're going to have a lot of, really rough drafts first. But to really look at that as just data that you can use to then, keep furthering your line of questioning, and to really just like persevere, and to not try to shape what you're doing in a way that has to look like what others are doing or what that's come before, but that is really seeking to move towards the questions that are deeply important to you. I think that helps us really stay independent, and to have kind of a never give up spirit, in the way we work.
Well, with that spirit in mind, what's your next question that you're asking? Where's your curiosity leading to in terms of what are you working on?
I think one of the things that really emerged for me in the course of this work is, how do we understand the gaze? How do we look at one another, and how is that gaze, shifting, evolving? What external pressures try to shape our gaze, and how do we develop an inner compass to really understand like what we're seeing? And as such, I think that area of thinking about the gaze is something that I'm, kind of moving forward with, with new questions, particularly again with how messy and tumultuous the world is. And again, people asking questions about what is real, what is true, right? Is what I see in person versus what I see in the form of pixels, are they the same or are they different? And what is happening in that space in between that changes how I see something or perhaps someone? And so I think, in kind of thinking about the astronomer's eye, right? I am grateful to have had the opportunity to really shift a gaze to something that's much broader and hopefully more generous. And I hope to continually keep expanding that gaze as I move forward into new work.
Well, and as you do that, of course, readers will hopefully experience that with you, but still want to ask, any final thoughts you have for our listeners? What do you hope they take away from this conversation today?
Well, I think if listeners have a love of poetry, of astronomy, of graphic design, and who want to kind of, delve or share, stories of, like motherhood, of family diaspora, I hope that they'll find a lot to enjoy and explore, like in this collection, and that hopefully people come away with a sense of wonder. Hopefully, when we encounter even one another.
Monica Ong, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure.
That was Connecticut artist and visual poet Monica Ong. You can see a preview of her book, Planetaria, on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.